Good evening, everyone. My name is Anatoly Alexienko. I'm Professor of International Higher Education at the Education University of Hong Kong, as well as co-director of Center for Higher Education Leadership and Policy Studies, which co-organizes these webinars in collaboration with the Consortium of Higher Education Researchers in Europe. And today we have the last webinar this academic year. And this is Friday night here in Hong Kong, and I suppose in East Asia. So thank you very much for coming, as well as colleagues in the UK and Europe. We very much appreciate your participation today. So I have a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Dina Kiwan. She's Professor of Comparative Education and Deputy Director of Research and Knowledge Transfer Center at the College of Social Sciences at the University of Birmingham. She holds degrees from the universities of Oxford, Harvard, and UCL, which have positioned her for interdisciplinary research in psychology, sociology, and education. In 2015-16, she was the fellow at the Center for Lebanese Studies at St. Antony's College at the University of Oxford. And from 2012 to 2017, she was Associate Professor of Sociology at the American University in Beirut, Lebanon. So currently, she's academic co-director for the flagship 25 million Research Commission Center Initiative of the UK government's Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. And she also leads the Network Plus Disability Under Siege program, which is funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund of Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. In that role, she's working with the partners in Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine to address the challenges faced by most children with disabilities in that region. So tonight, or today, in different time zones, we will hear from Professor Kiwan's study on the challenges of academic freedom, as well as probably academic profession at the same time, in the context of transnational knowledge production. So as far as you can see, she'll be talking about a comparative study, bringing us into the context of Lebanon, UAE, UK, and the US. Without further ado, Dina, we are so thankful for your contribution to this webinar series, and we look forward to your presentation. After this, we will have a Q&A. If you want to ask questions, make comments, please use chat, but also I will invite you after Dina's presentation, so you will have time to reflect on these issues, and we'll talk about academic freedom. So Dina, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anatoly, for this kind invitation. It's an honor to be part of your webinar series. In my contribution today, as you've mentioned, I'm going to be drawing on my recently published book, Academic Freedom and the Transnational Production of Knowledge, published by Cambridge University Press. If you could go to the next slide, please. So on a personal and professional level, having studied and worked in the higher education context in the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Middle East, I've been struck how discourses of academic freedom are shaped by the socio-political, geographical, historical, and broader geopolitical contexts. Issues that are thought of as controversial and broaching the limits of academic freedom in one context are championed in another, challenging discourses as well as quantitative indices of academic freedom, tell a story that contrasting the global north as a haven for academic freedom with the global south as a context that punitively infringes on academic freedom. So my book aims to problematize this binary and illustrating the range of complex positionalities that arise and fundamentally how this links to the production of knowledge, what knowledge is legitimized and what knowledge is, quote, forbidden. It also recognizes that academic freedom and the production of knowledge is transnational, crossing national boundaries and contextualized in relation to the globalization of higher education, our societies and our mobilities across borders, both as students and faculty. So key issues in the field are that much of the work is highly polemical and ideological when you come to be talking about academic freedom. And there's not that much engagement on the production of knowledge side of things based on empirical data. Secondly, much of the work is mainly conducted in US and UK contexts, and the empirical work, where it exists, is predominantly in the form of survey data, lacking in qualitative contextual engagement with the socio-political, geographical, and historical contexts. And then we also see what I call a methodological nationalism. So there's a notion, there's an approach where it's quite siloed. You look at what academic freedom looks like in a single country, rather than recognizing that academic freedom is transnational and the production of knowledge is transnational, crossing borders. And then finally, there's an elision with debates relating to free speech. That tends to dominate, especially in the public domain, in the media, focus on freedom of speech and relatively less engagement with the production of knowledge. So my approach in my book was that I conducted 37 one-hour Skype interviews with academics from Lebanon, the United Arab Emirates, the UK, and the United States. It spanned a really wide range of subjects from humanities, social science, and science disciplines, covering topics like bioethics, genetics, psychology, American studies, anthropology, education, gender studies, critical race theory, geography, history, Islamic studies, journalism, law, medical humanities, Middle East studies, philosophy, politics, theology, security studies, and sociology. So you could see really a very wide domain. And several of the academics that I spoke to had experiences across the four contexts. So they may have lived or worked in different places, or they may be based in one place and they conduct their research in another, or they have partnerships with researchers in other places and they travel. What I'm going to talk about a little bit is the role of the university transnationally, and then situating legitimate and forbidden knowledge in that frame as well. Next slide, please. So the role of the university. So there's an intellectual history of higher education playing a role in the promotion of democratic societies. And we can look to Dewey and Wright Mills, for example, and the development of informed critical citizens in relation to the emergence of the modern nation state, and now evident in discourses of global citizenship. In some discourses on the civic university, a liberal education is seen as central in the production of a particular kind of critical citizen. And it's been argued that higher education is one of the few remaining public spaces where we can explore unpopular ideas, and that students can learn how to challenge authority. In the Arab world, few universities constitute a public sphere for critical debate, although notable exceptions include the American University of Beirut in particular, and before the 1970s especially, where public intellectuals, reformists, and nationalists engaged with the public on social and political issues of the day, and to some extent continue to have that role today. Historically, in the colonial context, education was a means of rule, and these traditions continue to exist today in post-colonial states. In many Arab countries, there's a tradition of public universities developed predominantly after the Second World War, when the national university typically became the symbol of a new national identity, development, and autonomy. However, in Lebanon, the majority of universities are private, as the Civil War context undermined the state's ability to promulgate a state-controlled higher education system. And then if we look at the United Arab Emirates, this illustrates the Gulf's region prioritizing establishing what's referred to as a knowledge economy. And we can see this, for example, with Dubai's Knowledge Village. And increasingly, Western universities are opening branch campuses driven by financial interests, including concerns to improve rankings through internationalization. Two key themes identified by my interviewees linking the role of the university to the production of knowledge and academic freedom include contestation over the mission of the university and its relation to its situated context, and also the internationalization of HE. Next slide. So university mission. So, I mean, there are different conceptions of knowledge that underpin different university missions. The construction of the university as a producer of pure knowledge conceives of knowledge production and knowledge as truth central to this mission, whilst the application of knowledge for social and economic purposes underpins university missions centered around creating economic growth. And then there's a third model where the university is seen rather as a change agent. And so there the emphasis is much more on the social and political contextualization of knowledge. Next slide. Contestations over the nature of truth and knowledge are situated in relation to debates about the canon, interdisciplinarity, and positionality. Knowledge is inherently political and partial, with the university ideally providing a space for enabling inclusive knowledge production. It's further been argued that knowledge and truth in the humanities and social sciences are particularly prone to contestation, and so that they need actually more protection of academic freedom. In the Middle East context, a professor of history notes that in comparison to the United States, a liberal education is not seen as valuable. This is not the case in the vast majority of the Arab world, he says. The vast majority of the Arab world, most have professional degrees. The professional degrees are not based on a liberal education approach. So the situation is much more critical, I think, in the Arab world. In addition, however, in the Middle East, there's the perception that humanities and social sciences are potentially dangerous. So in particular in the United Arab Emirates context, higher education administrators are concerned to play it safe, although in contrast, academics report experiencing the freedom to teach whatever they want. Indeed, a US professor of anthropology researching on the Gulf Arab region argues that, quote, "There's no such thing as absolute academic freedom. It's just within particular kinds of constraints everywhere we go, whether they're forthright or whether they are, nationalist, whether they're part of the tenure system, which is incredibly hierarchical. So I feel like people learn the codes of the places that they're in, whether those are corrupt or not, and then regulate themselves in particular kinds of ways. And then it's interesting because it becomes censorship in some contexts, and in other contexts, it's just business as usual, The next slide. So moving on to the internationalization of higher education, we're witnessing private higher education rapidly expanding, with a shift from higher education being seen as a public good to a private good, driven by funding shortages. Higher education is increasingly seen as a means to provide access to the global economy and therefore leading to increased enrolment. And we see imported internationalization, that's the establishment of numerous partnerships with US and UK universities, especially in the Gulf Arab states, keen on establishing a knowledge economy. Also, similarly, in addition to Dubai Village, there's also Doha's Education City. And there you have like a concentration of branch campuses of prestigious US and UK universities. And what's of note also, it's interesting that a third of all branch campuses globally are located in the Arab region and have opened since the year 2000. These branch campuses typically specialise in a few academic fields, usually professional fields, such as business, accountancy, technology, education and engineering. And they hire foreign faculty from the affiliate institution and grant degrees from this affiliate institution. In contrast, institutions established in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, such as the American University of Beirut and the American University in Cairo, these were established by foreign missionaries based on US liberal arts models of education and have US charters. The UAE's internationalization strategy has been successful in transforming it into one of the leading transnational educational hubs in the world, and it has a high outbound student mobility, which has increased by 31% over 4 years from 2012 to 2016, with the UK and US being the most popular destinations. However, there's significant inbound student mobility, which is rising exponentially and has the highest rate in the world at 48.6%. According to UNESCO in 2023, the UAE, with a population of 9 million, hosted 220,000 international students, which is proportionately more compared with both the UK and the US in relation to their populations and their international students. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about forbidden knowledge, which perhaps you might get a sense of what that means. But just to focus a little bit on the conception of it as developed in the literature. This conceives of knowledge that's seen as being too sensitive, dangerous, or taboo to produce. And this has also been referred to as knowing what knowledge not to produce. And the operationalization of these non-knowledges can entail both formal and informal processes, including self-censorship, internal university restrictions, and external socio-political restrictions. The production of non-knowledge is not just gaps in knowledge, but agency is invoked in not actually producing this knowledge, which is a neglected area of research. And there's a relative lack of interrogation of how discourses in socio-political and historical contexts shape the absence of certain knowledges. Given my transnational approach to the study of the production of knowledge, including forbidden knowledge, my empirical data provides accounts of daily lived experiences of academics operating in and against this terrain. So rationales for forbidden knowledges include the following. Fear, one theme is around fear of misapplication of findings. The majority of interviewees I spoke to had a fairly relaxed approach to academic freedom, often only expressing concern to the application if it was a misapplication, particularly in the relation to science. And this was typically framed in relation to ethical issues arising from the misapplication of technology. And I've got a quote here, I won't read it all out to you, but we can return to particular examples in the discussion. And we see these sorts of arguments also in relation to debates with assistive reproductive technologies, same-sex parenting, increased multiple births, sex selection, and eugenics practices that continue currently in the form of prenatal screening, for example. Next slide, please. Another area is around uncomfortable truths. So this is particularly evident when you look at studies on political conflicts between certain groups. So, for example, people referred to Northern Ireland and to Lebanon, arising instead in its place a strategic not knowing. And this is an area that's called ignorance studies in the literature. And here, this strategic non-knowing can actually be weaponized in policy debates. And we saw this actually with COVID-19 pandemic. The term coined here was institutionalized ignorance, where they showed how statistical data was deleted in Brazil, for example, during the pandemic. Then we can also move to the notion of taboo topics, bioethics, psychology, and controversial science. In particular, in the UK and US context, research on abortion, euthanasia, infanticide, and behavioral genetics were highlighted and positioned in relation to religious and political perspectives. The temporal and spatial fluidity of the construct of controversiality is illustrated, how we can see content is not fixed, but this can change over time and by geographical location. Slide 10. Okay, so this is a quote from an author who worked in psychology and genetical influences on student attainment in schools. And at the periods when he was working, it was, he refers to it as dangerous professionally to talk about genetic influence. It would be seen as potentially racist and towards being eugenic as well. And so he delayed publishing his book for quite a period of time, but in the end did publish it. But he talks about how he had self-censored himself for 30 years before producing this work. Next slide. Another area of work is Palestine, particularly timely in the context that we're living through now. So a number of academics, and this was interviewed, in 2019 when I was collecting the data. A number of academics interviewed commented on the challenges of conducting research on Palestine in both the US and UK contexts. And these observations were made by both academics who themselves work or have worked in the field, as well as those outside the field. For some, the precarity and the emotional, psychological, and economic repercussions were just too much to deal with, and a lot of people who worked in that area have moved out. Some scholars were concerned about job security, in particular those without tenure in the US system, and they perceive that there would be a significant risk in pursuing such research. And this sense of vulnerability can be compounded by being blocked from leadership positions within the university, difficulties in getting funding, and being listed on such websites as Canary Mission and Campus Watch. The positionality of the scholar, so who you are as an academic producing the knowledge, also affects the extent and the nature of exclusion, where those of Palestinian, Muslim, or Arab heritage experience the highest levels of exclusion. The geopolitical positionality also mediates the experience and the nature of restrictions, as illustrated in the case of the study of Palestine through American Studies at the Center for American Studies and Research at the American University in Lebanon. And this is the second quote from a professor of American Studies, himself American, who spent a period of time at the American University of Beirut leading their Center for American Studies. And he said, in the United States, it was impossible, at least when I went to Beirut in 2011, it was still very difficult in the US to engage those conversations without being accused of being anti-Semitic, frankly. And Beirut and AUB was for me, and I specify that this was specifically for me, because I know it's not for everybody. It was a very open place to engage in the kinds of research that I was doing. The center became an oasis for those of us who are interested in a critique of US empire that focused on US policy in the Middle East. And that's because it opened up an avenue for discourse that was difficult in the United States. Next slide, please. Another area was around gender and sexuality. For example, there's been research on increasing youth identification with transgender identities that has become very controversial in the UK and the US. Other issues include the perception of topics from the main university campus that may be considered to be controversial on branch campuses, and they result in a cautious approach from senior management. But yet, from accounts from lecturers, and this is in the United Arab Emirates, the perceived controversial of the nature of the topic often differs depending on, whether it's being seen by the administration or by the lecturer and the students themselves. If we can go to the next slide, please. Another theme that emerged under this theme of forbidden knowledge relates to race and religion, and also within that bracket, also security and extremism. Again, this was actually seen across all four contexts and as well constructed transnationally. Academics working in the field of race and gender in the United Kingdom comment on the institutional mechanisms and initiatives that can undermine or neutralize their work by occupying the space and defining the terms of diversity work. And funding priorities can also redirect critical work on race and gender into more acceptable forms. Constraints relating to work on extremism in the UK context face similar pressures and sit uncomfortably in relation to government initiatives such as Prevent, which is a policy which aims to tackle extremism and co-opt higher education institutions into this policy work. The difficulty in conducting research on security in the Middle East has been seen also in the United Arab Emirates with the case of a UK PhD student who was detained and imprisoned in Dubai in 2018. Funding priorities also present certain constructs of security, directing research within these constructs. The experience of infringement of academic freedom as a result of an ensuing bullying environment and a culture of self-censorship is also highlighted as a means of securing the boundaries of forbidden knowledge. Sometimes we witness in the press, for example, horror stories of academic persecution, and it's been argued that these act as cautionary tales to make the public aware and share the boundaries of forbidden knowledge. So what emerges overall is that the nature and content of forbidden knowledge is fluid over time, and it's also geopolitically situated. And the accounts illustrating the difference in how forbidden knowledge is constructed and negotiated in both teaching and research in the domains of gender and sexuality in Lebanon, the UAE, UK, and the United States. It's a strategic construction shaped geographically, politically, and socially. It's not just gaps in knowledge. For those working on controversial topics, the boundary work that these academics engage in is a form of labor, and it takes its toll emotionally, economically, and physically through hostile environments, challenges to publishing, travel bans, and even imprisonment. Go to the next slide, please. So what is legitimated knowledge? Now, examining examples of various systems of legitimation include, for example, disciplinary methodology, university world rankings, impact, employability, and publications. And legitimate knowledge is not just the opposite of forbidden knowledge, but it also relates to the dynamics and the relationships of power in what knowledge is deemed acceptable and validated. And within this construct of legitimated knowledge, authority is central. In order to understand legitimacy, we need to understand that this is underpinned by authority, and so it invokes relations of power. Legitimacy has a normative status with implied validation. In sociological terms, legitimacy is a collectively formulated process of justification where people come to agree on what is accepted as true. So as such, knowledge invokes belief. I've got a quote on here that is an example of this. This is around research on race and intelligence, for example, that exemplifies this. So what are the routes to legitimate knowledge? So positionality, so you know your status and perceived right of knowledge authority in processes of legitimation. So this relates to the perceived right of the knowledge authority, and the processes by which that comes to be recognised. Discourses of civility. Now, this is interesting. The concept of civility has often been used to discredit critique by focusing on how the critique is delivered. It's argued that the history of the discourse of incivility has operated as a form of racial and class undercutting or discrimination in both the US and European contexts since the 19th century. The binary of civility, incivility can be seen as a more politically correct yet masked reformulation of the cultured, uncultured binary, which is openly colonial. Massad, who's a professor based at Columbia University, draws a parallel with the case, is a famous case of an academic called Stephen Salater, who had been appointed, who'd been offered a job at the University of Illinois, and then that was rescinded based on his tweets on the war in Gaza back in 2014. And what Massad says about that is that he draws a parallel with that case and challenges that he himself has faced while at Columbia University, where Arab American colleagues have commented on his vulgar Arab incivility and immoderation. The story with Stephen Salater was that he was offered an academic position as a professor of Native American studies, but it was withdrawn after a result of university donor objections, as I said, to his tweets criticizing Israel and Zionism in the context of a 51-day Israeli military assault of Gaza back in 2014. When it was interesting to note that the framing of him not having that offer removed was framed in terms of civility. So what we cannot and will not tolerate at the University of Illinois are personal and disrespectful words or actions that demean and abuse either viewpoints themselves or those who express them. And this was quoted from the Chancellor of the University in August 2014. There's another area around skills and employment. So education gains its value in terms of how that translates into employment in the workplace. Its economic value and marketability. And then funding and international partnerships. So increasingly there's a discourse with funders of having Global South partnerships over the last decade or so. And it supports, the rationale supports the participation of more marginalized partners in co-constructing research agendas. But it's been argued that there still fundamentally is a problem that the Global South tends to provide the data and doesn't actually set the theoretical or research agendas, which is central in the larger social process of knowledge production. And a number of interviewees talked about this, who are based in the Global South, of their experiences of research partnerships with academics in the US and the UK, for example. Next slide. So I'm just going to conclude now, and I'm happy to go into other examples in more depth in the questioning. I feel I've gone through it quite quickly. But I think the main points we can come away with is that understanding that academic freedom has historically been defined through a sort of a nationalist lens. And yet, with the globalization of higher education and of our societies and mobility, we need to rethink what academic freedom means in a more transnational frame. And also, there's a real lack of qualitative lived experience data globally, but particularly in the outside of the US and UK contexts. And so this book has made the case for a transnational theoretical framework to recognize that the transnational production of knowledge is very much linked to the internationalization and massification of higher education globally. And so we need to have a contextualized approach to understanding academic freedom. We also, what comes out of my work, given that I looked at 4 particular case study countries, is that unlike what we hear in the media and the public domain and from more quantitative indices of academic freedom, the Middle East is not an exception. Forbidden and legitimated knowledges are evident across all country contexts, so sociocultural, politically and historically positioned, and they're operationalized through a range of internal and external restrictions. We need to move, as I've said, away from these methodological frames to account for our transnational research partnerships and also fluidity in the nature of academic freedom in different contexts. And transnational frameworks highlight the political economy of knowledge in the legitimation of knowledge, often consolidating the hegemony of the global north in its agency around knowledge production. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm very happy to take questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Dina, for your intriguing presentation. When I listened to this, I just immediately reflected on what was happening with me and my colleagues in terms of submission of research papers on Ukraine, and it's kind of the issues of precarity, emotional burden, just trying to understand all these types of tensions at that time was a challenge. So all those terms that you used in your research just give some kind of perspective in terms of what researchers who are vulnerable or who are positioned in these kind of complex situations may be experiencing. Let me open the floor to questions and comments. Feel free to raise your hand, please, and we will invite you to give a comment or ask a question. As well, please feel free to use the chat room if you want to put your comment into the chat room. So I can see a hand raised by Uliana Pedzametsky. So Uliana.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate your thoughtful unpacking of the dilemmatic of what constitutes knowing, and then the dearth of narrative experiential data to inform what we understand as knowing. And as I think about this, I'm wondering, what do you feel is the role of societies in transnational, one could even say accessless or boundless knowledge production and its distribution? Is it the provision of a space for the voice of the public intellectual beyond the confines of the university? Is it in pushing back as a stakeholder against methodological nationalism, given that both future students and scholars derive from society? Is it to advocate from the grassroots position for different knowledges, including the so-called forbidden knowledges? In other words, are partnerships and collaborations outside of academia mechanisms for moving forward, for enabling freedom? And I too ask this from the perspective of educational research about Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you for that. You've got quite a lot in there, and it's really an area that is getting increasingly framed in universities as knowledge transfer. But I think it also misses the point as is there I'm hearing another voice. Okay, yeah. So I think it's also, as you've alluded to, Ulana, about how we conceive of knowledge and opening up that frame in terms of alternative knowledges and who produces it. You know, whether it's the arts, it can be public art, it can be young people on social media, it can be even, you know, social change protests are a form of knowledge. And often these youth-led protests, I mean, we just need to look at what's happening with the student encampments across the US and in Europe globally, are themselves a form of knowledge that is cutting across national boundaries. So I think that's something that's not necessarily led by universities, and often universities unfortunately are more conservative when it comes to you know, the social changes that we see in society, whether it's, you know, women's rights and you know the other you know, geopolitical changes, say in Vietnam and South Africa, and things that we've witnessed throughout history. Often universities are on the conservative side. So I think absolutely alternative knowledges is really plays a very important part.
Okay, thank you. I can see Professor Varghese.
Okay, thank you. You know, I have a question. You have used the word legitimizing knowledge. Who is the ultimate authority to legitimize knowledge? So, for example, if I look at from a national context, a forbidden knowledge may not be legitimized in the national boundaries, but internationally it may be legitimized.
Yes.
So who is the final authority to talk about legitimacy of knowledge and legitimization, and how it is going to guide the knowledge production process?
Well, that's the thing. Knowledge is often contested. So there is, it tends to be those who hold the power who then are able to come down and declare what knowledge has been agreed on. And this link, you know, we think of knowledge as truth, but it implicates a process by which we all believe, especially in the social sciences, but in the sciences as well, where we come to believe that something is accepted and is given as true. So it's a continually negotiated, fought out process on what gets legitimated, and it's when you see structures like disciplines do a lot of that legitimating work, and often, you know, that's why there's often criticism on interdisciplinary work, because it's moving away from those confines of what was deemed as the proper way to do sociology or the proper way to do economics, for example.
Thank you. To you, Joan, I can see your hand and I can see two comments in the chat room. I'll continue after she asks a question.
Hello, Dina. I'm a PhD student from University of Edinburgh. So my question would be that in terms of the forbidden knowledge, how would you conceptualize the nuance between different disciplines? Let's say AHS's fields and STEM fields, because to me, like your empirical data identifies several sensitive topics. But when the STEM participants, academics, are claimed to touch upon these kind of sensitive topics, it would be more likely to be a claim for their freedom of speech rather than academic freedom itself, because academic freedom should be based on one's scholarship and fields of knowledge.
I'd be interested if you have examples, but I think it even with science, it does. I mean, it can work through funding, for example, that, there may you just won't get the funding for areas of work that would be perceived to be ethically problematic in the science domain. It tends to be around research ethics, and especially around that first theme that I highlighted, the fear of the misapplication of findings. So I think that's more than just freedom of speech, but I'm sure it can be both. But I was just wondering if you have a specific example in mind.
Right. Yes. Sorry. Just talk more. So for STEM participants, when they're applying for the research grants, I can't say completely, but it is possible that they won't touch any political sensitive topics, but they can still gain the research grants in terms of what they've applied and in terms of what they are expertised in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true to a certain extent, but I think to have an area that's been agreed on to fund in itself has gone through, a political and ethical process of considering whether it should be legitimate or not. I guess I'm just wary to kind of invoke that, it's social sciences and humanities that mainly have a problem with academic freedom as opposed to science. I think, we think of science as objective and stripped away from political and social aspects, but it's often that it's just implicit or not really explicitly.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Let me just read a question from Giulio Marini, who is asking, have you found more problems in the teaching side of our job or in the research one?
I think it's hard to quantify. I guess I was focusing a bit more on the research because I was particularly interested in the production of knowledge. But certainly, especially as we've moved to a system in most universities where, students pay for their degrees. I mean, this is a big shift in the UK when higher education was free to since the late 90s, where tuition fees have been introduced. We see a very different dynamic between lecturers and students and the expectations of institutions, where the student is seen as a client, as a consumer. And so that sheds a very different light on what's delivered in the curriculum and what happens if students complain. But also there's more of a notion of, also the critical awareness of young people also around, say, the decolonization agenda has also been an important one in, universities having to think about their curriculum and challenges to kind of the traditional traditional expectations of what knowledge people should know. So I think it's both. It's just that in my study, perhaps I focused a bit more on the research.
Thank you. Douglas Robertson is wondering if you are familiar with Julia Schlick's new book, Dirty Knowledge, Academic Freedom in the Age of Neoliberalism, and what you think of her approach to academic freedom within this dominant neoliberal context.
I'm afraid I haven't come across that. What's the name?
Dirty Knowledge. Douglas, would you like to elaborate if you're available? What is that book about?
Yeah, I am available. The reason I asked that question is that your approach, which I agree with heartily, is very similar to the approach of that book in the sense of not being naive about knowledge being situated in power structures and the role of authority and that sort of thing. And essentially what the book is arguing is within a US context, is that is to be more honest about that and also accept, as I hear you say also, the sort of coercive work of disciplines as well as politicians. And so I mean, when you think of it in those terms, there's a press on the researcher or the knowledge producer from within the discipline and from without. And her approach is essentially, I think is what I hear you saying in a much larger international context, which I really like, that is to be frank about that and to not pretend that scholars policing themselves have some sort of purity of purpose. Let me stop there.
Yeah, thank you. I'll check out that book. That sounds very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Boris Uslu, I saw your hand, and then I'll give word to Begenç Yazov.
Thank you very much, Anatol Hocam. This is Barış from Turkey, where our higher education system is highly politicized and we deeply experience self-censorship, as you can guess. On the other hand, there are many different examples from different countries. When we consider some criticizing movements in USA, considering Israel and Palestine conflict, and some presidents were resigned, some students were arrested, and Ukraine has different story and different conditions, problems. On the other hand, when we think about all these examples, global examples, do you consider academics are carried out necessary actions or movements to preserve this academic freedom as one of the essential elements for the higher education? Or what should academics to do to preserve and ensure their academic freedom?
Yeah, so. I mean, I think absolutely. Academic freedom is a critical feature that shouldn't be neglected by higher education institutions, and I think it should always be kept in mind and remembered that the development of academic freedom came very much in the context of protecting those who didn't have power to say unpopular things or things that challenged the status quo. What we've seen increasingly, for example, in the UK, is that academic freedom is being weaponized. So it's being used as a weapon by those who already have power to shut down people who are actually more marginalized or vulnerable or less able to speak. So as always, there are these political games. I suppose the how question is the much harder. How do you do that? And I just think, it's solidarity between academics in different parts of the world that's really important.
This is important. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. There's a question from Begenç Yazov. He's asking, how do international funding bodies might influence academic freedom in the countries they operate in your case, Middle East?
Yeah. So, I mean, this has been an experience for me. At the beginning, when you introduced me, you mentioned my project, which is a UK Research Council funded project, Disability Under Siege, where I work with academics in Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. And what we see sometimes with these, with all sorts of funders, prestigious funders and other funders, is that there are mechanisms and systems that perhaps inadvertently, maybe on purpose, but can inadvertently already limit the academic freedom or co-equitable, co-production of knowledge. So, for example, it has to be a UK-based person who is the lead of the project, as opposed to, say, the funding allowing for a lead being in another country. And or also, for example, what amounts of the budget can go where also limits what you can actually do and who can take leadership. So it often falls into a model that the UK lead devises the project, gets some comments from the other leads, and then the other leads in the other countries in effect end up acting like subcontractors rather than true partners. There are developments and changes. So, for example, within the UK context, I know that the Wellcome Trust is doing a lot of thought in this space around Global South partnerships, and UKRI as well is developing. And even the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office Research Commissioning Centre, they're very keen for us, and I'm leading on a strategy of Global South engagement for this Research Commissioning Centre. And the idea is to work and produce this with the Global South partners in our consortium, and actually develop action plans and evaluate, monitor and evaluate. And in a sense, it's a way to kind of check a working system. So I think there are still lots of problems, but at least now it's more on the agenda. And I think funding bodies are starting to pay attention to it.
Thank you. I have one more question, and I think this will be our last question for tonight. So Crystal, who is asking, she's wondering how to treat different perceptions of academic freedom. In her research, she finds different groups have different understandings towards academic freedom. Are there a united or widely accepted understanding of academic freedom?
I think it's the nature of any concept that has a complicated history, and I don't think we can come to a single definition. I think just what's important is recognizing that academic freedom, it started from within a specific context, and as contexts change, we reevaluate if it's doing the work that we need it to do, and then it can be revised and changed accordingly so that it does fit our purposes. So whereas once it might have been much more nationally framed, I'm arguing we need to consider it in a much more transnational frame now. So I'm sorry not to give a neat answer to that, but yeah, and I don't think it's a problem necessarily. There's always going to be contestations over concepts.
Thank you.
I mean, sorry,
Yeah.
I could just also add, obviously, they're the legal definitions, which, one can follow, and those may be more sort of defined, as it were. And then as a sociologist, I guess I'm more at ease with a multiplicity and different ways of conceiving things.
On this note, I will be thanking Professor Dina Kiwan for her insightful and really important presentation. And we all should read the book, which is available now through Cambridge University Press. And you should order this for your libraries in universities to encourage your students to read, your future doctoral students who are our new generation of professors. And I guess this is important for all of us to really understand how these transnational academic production networks and geopolitics and other issues, how they really influence our perceptions of academic freedom, but also how they urge us for more research, more discussion, and more readings in this area. So thank you very much, Dina, for the opportunity to listen to your presentation, and thank you everyone who took part in this conversation and asked questions. Have a great summer.